Hi and welcome to this 2024 winter update. I just thought I'd give you a bit of a rundown on what's been happening in the garage. First up, I'd like to mention that I went to an open day for the Australian-built Savic motorcycles at their showroom in West Melbourne. That was last Saturday and had a reasonable turnout. There were some people there who'd placed deposits on machines, and just other interested members of the motorcycling public had turned up to have a look at a number of the prototypes. And also there was production motorcycle number 3 was on the showroom floor, and that was done up in a really tasty carbon fibre bodywork, which is one of the options you can get. There's 2 models available. There's the Alpha, which is the fully powered large battery model, and then there's the Delta, which is a slightly less expensive model which has a smaller battery pack and slightly less output from the electric motor. The styling could be considered a little bit divisive amongst the motorcycle community. It sort of has a tendency to be a bit of a love or hate sort of relationship, you might say. You either like it or you don't. Personally, I think it actually does look quite good. I see no reason why an electric motorcycle should look like an internal combustion engine motorcycle, and certainly it is setting a statement of what it is, and it certainly doesn't hide the fact the way some of the other electric motorcycles have a tendency to do. Is the future going to be electric for motorcycling? That's hard to say. Hydrogen is sort of being developed in Japan, particularly by Kawasaki for motorcycles, but whether hydrogen is going to be a valid alternative to gasoline or petrol, as we call it in Australia, I don't know, because there's certainly no real source of supply in Australia for hydrogen on the domestic front yet. And I think as batteries become lighter and cheaper, that electric motorcycles will probably become the dominant force in Australia. Yeah, and I know there's a lot of you diehards who will probably never own an electric motorcycle, and I certainly respect that. And while I love my internal combustion engine motorcycles, I'm certainly realistic, and I believe that we need a green future for motorcycling as well as for automobiles. Anyway, that's enough about talking about electric motorcycles. I'll move on to what's been happening with my bikes in the garage. We'll start off with the Moto Guzzi Le Mans, since I'm standing right here in front of it. And over the past year, I've done a service on it, which is just an oil filter change and oil. And I've done a service video in the past on that, so I didn't bother doing one on that again. I've also changed the air cleaner element at a slightly later stage. I do find that the air cleaner elements on these bikes, which are a paper element, stay remarkably clean. It must be where the air pickup is. I mean, the air filter box on the Benelli is always full of bugs and grass seeds, whereas the one on the Moto Guzzi really just has a little bit of light dust in it. And even the filter I took out wasn't that badly soiled. And that's the second filter I've put in the bike in my, I think, around 12 years ownership. And probably that's over about 20 to 30,000 kilometres. Hard to say, I haven't actually looked up the figures. Now, the other thing that I've done to the bike in the past year, I put some new front brake pads in, or just one set. Those of you who know Moto Guzzis will know that they have a linked braking system in this era, which means that the handbrake lever on the bars just operates the right-hand front caliper, and the foot pedal operates the left-hand front caliper and the rear caliper through a proportioning valve. It's sort of an early form of integrated braking, I guess. And, you know, for the period it worked quite well, but by today's standards, the brakes on these bikes are fairly weak and require a lot of pressure to do a bit of decent braking. Now, I do find that the pads wear unevenly, which is why I only needed to replace the one set of pads on the handbrake lever. And that is due to the fact that no matter how hard you try with pressure on the foot pedal, you find that your braking is not perfectly balanced. And if you do try to apply more pressure on the foot pedal, particularly in damp conditions, you do run the risk of locking up the rear brake. So in that respect, linked braking isn't really giving you the best braking possible for an era of motorcycle that, while it didn't have great brakes, it had the best brakes of the era. The one other thing I've done to the Moto Guzzi Le Mans is I've fitted Oxford heated grips. And that's really a concession to my ageing body. Over the past winter, we had a few days when I went out where it was so cold that my fingers were turning blue before I'd even got more than, I think, 15 or 20 kilometres. So I fitted heated grips to the Moto Guzzi only. I find that the Moto Guzzi is the most comfortable bike to ride in colder weather because of its half fairing. You get a bit of protection from the wind on your hands anyway. So fitting the heated grips to that bike was certainly a plus. But on the really cold days, I did find that whilst the palms of my hands were quite hot, the fingers could still be quite cold. So that probably means I need to upgrade my winter gloves a bit too, but could just be a sign of the lack of circulation. One other thing I've done to the Moto Guzzi Le Mans in the past year is I fitted a new rear tyre as well. And I fitted a matching Avon Road Rider to the rear. And I'm quite happy with the Road Riders, though I can't say what their performance is in the wet. Certainly in winter conditions they seem to be fine, but I really don't ride that much in the rains unless I'm caught out in it. So I'm not really probably the best person to ask on their wet weather performance, but in the dry, I found them to be a superb sporting tyre on my Le Mans. Okay, we'll move on to the Gilera 350. Again, I haven't done that much on that bike over the past year. The only thing I've done is I've replaced the front disc on it. One of the previous owners had converted the semi-floating front disc to a full floater by removing the, there's sort of a cup bevel washer and making it a fully floating system. The downside of that is that the buttons that hold the disc to the rotor have worn rather badly, and the disc was rattling quite loudly at times, and I really just didn't think it was particularly safe. So I decided to replace that, and certainly it's much nicer to ride because it's a lot quieter, no more rattling. That's about all I've done to the Gilera apart from ride it. And again, it's just a delight to ride. It's just a fabulous motorcycle for riding. The only downside is it's quite uncomfortable for an older rider who's got stiff joints. So I find I'm limited to really 100 to 120 kilometres on that bike before I find it a bit painful or I need another coffee break. Still, it's a really endearing motorcycle, and I'd be loath to part with it. Well, now we'll move on to my Benelli 1130 TNT. I've been doing a little bit of work on that. In my last winter update, I mentioned that there was some oil seeping out on the little drain hole underneath the water pump. Well, I ended up taking the water pump out because that leak became a little bit more substantial, and discovered that the lower housing in the water pump had cracked, which was causing the bearing that held on the shaft to actually wobble. And that was causing the oil seal to leak. There was no water coming out, so it hadn't actually affected the mechanical seal. So I had to source a second-hand lower water pump housing, new bearings, oil seal, and a new mechanical seal, and I've reassembled and reinstalled that water pump in the Benelli TNT. The only other maintenance I've done on that bike recently is that I've replaced the brushes in the starter motor. The bike's only done 46,000 kilometres, but the brushes were completely worn out, and it was getting quite difficult to start at times. It was just not cranking over at any, with any decent velocity. So, I sort of thought initially it may have been the battery. I replaced the battery, that seemed to be fine. Also replaced the starter solenoid again. I've been using fairly low-cost Chinese starter solenoids on the bike, so I thought it may have been that, but it turned out to be the brushes. And the starter motor's not too hard to get out. You just got to take the solenoid off and the associated wiring, undo 2 bolts, And whilst it may be possible to pull it out the side, I found that the positive terminal on the alternator was in the way. So I took the tank off and just lifted it out the top, pulled it apart, replaced the brushes. It comes as a kit because the brush that is the earth lead is its lead is spot welded to the brush housing, and the brush that has the positive lead is spot welded to the terminal, so you just have to reassemble that in the starter motor. Put a couple of bits of wire in to hold the brush springs out of the way while you reassemble it. The armature into the rear housing, pull the bits of wire, and then assemble the starter motor with new O-rings and reinsert into the motorcycle. Now it's starting like a champ. So that's really all I've done to the Benelli TNT. I haven't actually been riding it that much over the past 6 months because of the slow starting problems. But I've had it out a few times in the last few weeks and done a few 100Ks on it, and I'm really enjoying it again. Well, that really covers my 3 motorcycles. We'll move over to my wife's 750 Breva. And as you can see, there's nothing there. And that's because it was actually stolen about 8 weeks ago. It was parked up outside the Alfred Hospital where my wife works, and someone broke the steering lock and hot-wired the ignition and actually rode it off. It was recovered about 2 weeks later, but the insurance company had decided it was already written off because after 2 weeks, if it's not recovered, they write off a vehicle. It probably wasn't worth repairing anyway. It had light damage down the left-hand side, indicators, clutch lever, front mudguard was damaged, and it looked like someone had damaged the tank around where the seat goes on, as if they were trying to lever the seat off. And there was, the screen was missing, and there were a few other little issues with it. Electrical issues, of course, because the wiring had been cut and shut. So it was probably going to be, unfortunately, cost more than its actual market value to repair. I can't say that we've been particularly happy with the insurance company because it took close to 7 weeks after it was registered as a write-off for them to actually pay out. And during that time, my wife's actually been taking the train, which she hasn't been particularly pleased about. I know we could have probably purchased another motorcycle in the interim, but she really wanted to wait for the payout on the bike before outlaying any money, which would have probably come from the house loan to actually pay for another motorcycle. We haven't yet decided what we'll replace the Breva with, whether it's another Breva or a slightly later model V7. It could be one of those, or we may go for something completely different this time round. My wife's also thinking of retiring, so she may decide that she wants a motorcycle just for recreational purposes and not a commuter. But, only time will tell. And I'll probably do a review or update on that when we come to making a decision. So in reality, that's about all there is on this side of the shop. So I'll just move over to the woodworking side, and I've got a bit of an update on a special project we've been doing over there. Well, here we are on the other side of the shop, and this is the project here. I'll just turn it round. I'm sure you recognise these as organ pipes. What this actually is actually an organ clock. There will actually be a clock here. We're just working on the organ part of the project at the moment. So we've got the wind chest down here, and there's a number of relays in that wind chest. I can insert a photograph of those, which have little leather stops on them, which open and close the pathway for the air to the bottom of these pipes. Each one of these pipes, you can see that it just has a hole in the bottom. We didn't actually make the pipes, we actually purchased those from an organ builder. My son actually got a good price on the pipes and the relays. So the wind chest is at the front here. This is just the working case. There'll be a decorative case which will go around it once it's finished. So I'll just rotate it round again and we can see the back of it. Now here, on top here, is the air reservoir. I'll just lift that up. So this is a spill valve, and we've got bellows in here. I've actually got some video of it running, and I'll just insert that at that point so you can actually see there's a crank here, and it just pumps those bellows. Now we also need some electronics. They're currently off here. They're being wired by my son at the moment, but there's an aluminium plate that sits in the bottom here. I can insert a photograph of that so you can see what it looks like, we're using an Arduino processor and some opto-isolated relays, which will supply the power to the little relays underneath in the wind chest underneath the pipes. So the interesting thing is that organ clocks are not new. They've been around for a few hundred years, but in the past, of course, they've been fully mechanical. This one is sort of a hybrid, and that makes it a lot easier to make because there's less precision required in the mechanics, in that we're using relays that are driven by a microprocessor to run the whole thing. Now I'm hoping to do a video of the complete clock once it's finished, of the construction of it. So, that should be interesting in itself, if anyone is feeling the need to attempt a project like this. So that's really what's been going on over this side, and what's been occupying a fair bit of our time has been this particular project. Anyway, that's about all from me for the moment, and I promise I will try to do a few more videos over the coming year. And I'll catch you next time.